All right, thanks for attending, everyone. This is the weekly Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week's topic is localizing your apps. And let's dive right in and talk about what that means. Let's create a new Xojo project. Move that one out of the way. All right. So localizing your apps means that it is set up to support primarily languages in different countries and whatnot. So we'll create a little sample project here. Now, the important rule to remember when you're dealing with strings that you want to display to the user, if you're going to be localizing at any point, don't hard code your strings. So in particular, that means don't write code that looks like this, where you have your text hard coded like this. There's no support for localization for strings that are hard coded in this way because that's the only value that that string can contain unless you continue to assign it different values. So if you have pre-existing apps and you're littered with hard-coded strings like this, localizing is going to be a bit of work for you because you're going to need to convert them. And what do they need to be converted to? You're going to want to be using constants, and specifically dynamic constants. So let's take a look at something like this. The first thing, if you do have code that's already like this, one thing you can do to make it a little bit easier to convert them to constants is you can select it and you can right click on the item and you can see down here some of the refactoring controls, and one of them here is convert to constant. I can click this and you can see what it did here is it now is assigning s to a constant that was created that is now right here, and it used the name of the constant as whatever the text actually happened to be. And then you can see there's now a constant created here. It's not a dynamic constant, but it at least is a constant. So this is one way that you can start to migrate an app that you may have already pre-built and didn't take localization into account to start with. So you can go through and you can do that. If you are starting from scratch, however, and localization is something you're seriously considering, you should take that into account right with your design up front. And one thing that is a great way to do it is to probably create a module to contain all your localized strings. And you can just call the module something that's nice and easy to reference, something like strings. And then you can just add your constants to it as you normally would. So you can create a constant name, and we can give it a default value. And you can check the box here for dynamic. And this is what's going to allow it to be built appropriately with the different resource files in your application so that the languages can be loaded up. Now this just gives you a constant, nothing terribly unique or exciting about this, but the languages are specified here in the center area. And you click the plus button and you get a new row. And you can tweak a couple things. The platform lets you tweak text strings based on what you're building for OS 10, Windows, or Linux. But the language dropdown is the one that we're most interested in right now. And this is the one where you specify the language translation for your constant. So here I could pick English, and English would obviously be welcome. I could add another one here for French. And remember that I don't really speak other languages, so any of my attempts at typing in other languages, words or phrases here, you can assume I got them from Google Translate or guessed. But anyway, so you see we've now got two strings that are entered right here. And you can, of course, put any number of them in here. As you can see, there's plenty of languages to choose from. But you just list them all in here, one after another, for each area that you want to localize for. Now, once you have something set up like this, you can use your constant throughout your app in place of the hard-coded string. And we saw how you do that in code. It's pretty straightforward. You would just, use the constant name as you would any other constant. Let's see how we would use that. I'm going to make this bigger. We'll just do a quick little thing here. I'll make a big button. And one thing you can do is you can actually type the constant name in for the property of anything that displays text. And you precede it with the pound sign like I did here. And then you can give it the name of the constant. Now I want to go back and check because I want to see how I specified this. So I set it up as global. One thing I generally like to do is use protected so that you would refer to these constants as something like this. But that's just a personal preference. You could certainly make everything global. But then it might make it a little trickier to dream up all your constant names so that you don't have any conflicts. But with it set like that, I can type strings.ka welcome. And you can see that it did pull in from the constant the value, and it displays it right here in the layout editor for you. Now, another thing you can do with these dynamic constants, I'm going to add a couple more labels here. Is you can specifically fetch out a value or localized value from the dynamic constant. So here, let's get rid of this. Now say I want this particular label to actually show the French translation of welcome, even though it might be running on an English system. I can specify after the constant name the localization region code, and it'll pull it up and essentially fetch it for you. Now this technique is only going to work in code. You won't be able to use it in the layout editors or anything like that. But you can see here when we run this that it pulled up what we typed in for the French translation there because that's what we asked for. And of course, we could put the same thing so that they're both filled in. All right, I'm getting helpful advice from fellow Xojo developers from around the world that are telling me that I should use bienvenue, and Spanish might also be bienvenido. My pronunciation will also be suspect. But the process of localizing your app is, just a minor technical challenge. The act of actually localizing it, converting all your strings, well, that's where the real work comes in because, your apps are likely to have lots of strings and you're going to need them to be translated properly, which means you'll need someone that can speak both languages to make sure the translations make sense. Relying on something like Google Translate or other apps will get you there, but it might not be, very nice. So this is a cool, neat feature, and actually I didn't even know about this feature until probably a month or two ago, and it seems like it might have some neat uses. So let's go back to what's next on my list here. We got the specific language. So the language value here, you notice when you add a new one, the value that's filled in says default. Most of the time, you're not going to want to leave it at default. You're going to want, I shouldn't say most of the time, I pretty much make it a rule, make it a personal rule that you don't forget to always change it to the actual language that the value is for. So I could have left English here. Let me get rid of this one. I could have left English here as the default. It's the first one. And the app would still run okay and work as expected as long as I were building it on a system that had English as its primary language. But if I save my project with all my localization translations, all my English values specified as default, and I shipped it off to someone who lived in, say, France and was running their system with French as the default, as the primary language, and they built it, well, all the English strings are going to end up being plugged in, are going to be converted to French because French is the default language on that particular system. So you really want to stay away from using default, because essentially default just means at build time, convert this to whatever the current system language is. And that's a bit ambiguous and can have these weird little errors. So it's always just much clearer to just make sure you pick the specific language that the text is for. All right, and I will point out there's also another language setting here on the shared build settings. Also called default is what is there by default. And again, I don't recommend you leave it that way. I recommend you set it to whatever you want the primary language to be if no other languages are available on the system. You know, all of us here in the US are very English specific. So picking English, if you're building it here and you want that to be essentially be your fallback language, making sure everything says English there is the right way to set everything up. All right, I have a question here from John asking, when we look up the values, can we use the full language name, for example, typing in French here instead of just FR? And no, you actually have to use the official language codes. I'm sure if you Google around, you get a complete list of what all the 2-letter codes are. But they have to follow that particular pattern. You can't type it in that way. And there's even more specific ones. I'm forgetting I think I updated this in the user guide for release 4, which should be coming out sometime this month. And we can look it up after, but there's syntax where you can do something like this if you need a particular variant of a language. So this would be, this is probably 100% wrong, but this general idea is this would be English for Great Britain. But look for the exact syntax in the updated user guide. Localization is covered in the user guide, book 4. All right, Ken has a very good question here. How do you handle situations when the translated text is too long for the button or the label? So, you know, an example like this, it probably won't matter a heck of a lot, but if you've got your layout designed and you got everything perfectly positioned and you got nice buttons and everything's sized just the way you want, and then you plug in localizations and it turns out the translated text is much longer than whatever your normal text is. And this is a common problem going to languages like German, which tend to use much longer words than some other languages. And what's the way to do that? Well, that is just a general problem and annoyance that everyone has to deal with. One thing that we're working on for future versions of Xojo that'll first appear in the iOS layout editor is something called auto layout, which is a way to specify controls on a layout and their relationships to each other so they would resize automatically to fit their contents. Unfortunately, that's not in Xojo now, and it's not in most languages really. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to put some code in to adjust your controls. And in that case, and then of course you're going to have to test. It probably is going to make the most sense to maybe subclass controls where you think this is going to be a problem. And then, you know, realign and reposition them based on widths or languages or whatnot. But But the common thing I tend to see people do, because it's generally the easiest, is they redesign their layout to fit what they think the longest text will possibly be. No, there's no real great answer for that. That's just a general problem that people have to deal with. John is asking if these language codes are listed in online help. These here. No, at this point they're not. It's an incredibly long list that I would just probably crib a link from in, I'm sure there's official regional code standards organizations that have the official list somewhere. But if I can dig that up, I will at least put the link to it somewhere in the language reference. But like I said, it's pretty easy to Google and find the codes. And no, the code. Jim is asking if the codes are case sensitive. No, they're not case sensitive. And then Armando is asking if English would be used. If not, UK English is defined. Yeah, there's a fallback. So if you have, if you attempt to tell it to use a language that doesn't exist, well, I should say the other way around. If the system starts up and it has a system default language specified that is not a language that you use localized for, it goes through however the user's operating system preferences are set up to choose what language to actually display. And typically these are in some sort of order to say, all right, the primary language is English, and then secondary languages are these in this order, and then the system figures out what's to display. So English ones would, obviously fall back to English first. Now, if you have lots of text that needs to be translated, it's not going to be very easy. And the person doing the translating is not the person, that's developing your app. It's not going to be very easy or handy for you to, ship them a copy of Xojo and your project and say, just go ahead, monkey around in there and start changing text, adding the localized strings. Because that'd probably be a recipe for disaster. So we do have a way to export these strings to a file that can be used with another tool that we include with Xojo that is simpler, and that tool is called Lingua. And that allows you to export to localize for a specific language, and then you can import the file right back into Xojo and get the new languages in place. I'll show you how to use that here. I'm just going to scan a couple more questions. Eli is noting that once you decide to translate for a given language, finding the 2-character code will be the least of your problems. And that is very true. Ken is asking if localization works for web apps. And yes, Ken, we'll get to that momentarily. And Terry is asking, can you have the end user choose a language for the app outside of the OS language? And Terry, yes, I will touch on that momentarily as well. All great questions, and luckily a few of these I've anticipated. So let's take a look at this Lingua thing. Since I put my constants in their own module, I can just click on the module here. And if I go to the File menu, you can see there's an entry that says Export Localizable Values. I can click that. And now I can say, all right, which language do I want to localize for? So in this case, I'll pick German. So it's going to export all the strings that we have, all one of them. But normally you would have, obviously, a whole bunch of these for a real app. So we'll export that, and we'll just give it a name. So now we've got a file that's out on our disk, and I'm going to bring Finder over here. So if you go to your Xojo folder, in the Extras folder, there is a tool here called Lingua. You can run that, and or not. Let's try the one that I put in my webinar folder. Well, let me oh, I'm not going to let you see when I type in my password and stuff. The code signing on that was failing on my system here. All right, so now we have Lingo up. So I can hit the open button and choose that file that we just created. What did I call it? I call it locale sample. So I can just open that. And you can see here that it now shows you all the constants that we would have exported. We only have one. You can actually specify different values for the platforms, but we don't care about that. But you can click on each of them, and you wouldn't do this. You would hand this off to the person you found that is your savior that is going to translate things for you. So you would get them a copy of the Lingua app, and you would get them a copy of this file that you've exported. And you would say, all right, go to town. These are all the strings that I need translated. They would click on each one, see what the value is in the original language. And this is what's typed in the default value property for the constant. And then they can type in the translation. And then they can save the file. And we can close that. So after they go through and they do all of theirs, they would email you back the file, which you would then just drag. I'm going to, so we can see the change here. Drag it out of the way. You would just drag it back into your project. And then you would now see that German has been added. So you would essentially, depending on how many languages you're localizing to, you would send, and it's odds are you're going to have different people localizing to different languages. You would create one of these export files for each language that you need localized. You would send the person the file, and you would make the Lingua app available to them. They would go through, translate all the text, send you back the file. You'd add it back to your project, and boom, that part of the localization work is done. You're still going to need to go through the part of testing it on different systems and doing what was suggested before. Making sure that this new text fits in all your controls and still looks proper in all your layouts and all that stuff. But at least you have your text translated at that point. All right. All right. Now the question is, how do you build your app for multiple languages? Well, when you build your app, it has all the languages that are in it. That you've localized for. The setting that says which language to build for is not which language to include necessarily. It is which language to use if the user's system if the user's system is set to a language that you have not localized. So if their system is set to use, I don't know, Swahili, and you haven't localized for that, well, then it's going to default to English. But all the languages will be included in the build. And you see that when you build, actually, we can save that and see what one of the files looks like. So we'll do a build here. So you can see when you look at the Windows one, you'll see there's a resources folder that has files for each of the languages that you've localized. So all the strings are encapsulated in those. And the Windows one would have the same thing. I'm sorry, the OS X one has the same thing, but of course these are bundles and it's buried in here somewhere. Yeah, apparently here in the also in the resources part of the bundle, and it has all the stuff set up so that you can any of the languages are available. All right, so let's see where I am on my list. All right, the next thing we'll talk about is web. And I got one question here. Is there a difference between strings in code and strings in menu items? I'm not sure I completely understand the question. The strings in menu items, you can specify the same way as any string in any control, and I could type in here, and this would pull in the localized value for the system it's running on. So that works the same way as it does with any other control. And you can do this sort of thing anywhere there's a text or caption property on your controls. All right, so let's look at a web app. Everything we've talked about so far works exactly the same in a web app. You want to localize it, you're still going to use dynamic constants. That's the way to go. You need to use dynamic constants. The big difference, of course, is that the web app, it doesn't really care where the app itself is running because it's running on a server somewhere. What cares is the browser or the user that's connecting to the web app. So the way that the web app serves up the translated text is based on the session that's connecting. And apparently there's some stuff in the HTTP headers that contains this information. And the web app uses that to send back the appropriate text. So let's see if we can actually demonstrate that. I actually got this working. But if you've come to a lot of my webinars in the past, you'll notice that sometimes things I thought I had working really smoothly don't when I'm doing it live. So let's see here. All right, so I've added my strings module to this web project. And I am going to set it here. So now it shows up here. But the strings, this one is localized for English, French, and German. So let's just run this web app. So you can see my system here is running English. It showed the English version. That's great. So let's switch over to Chrome. And you can't do this with Safari. And I can't show you switching the system over to a different language because I believe that requires a logout on OS X. It's easier to flip the language on Windows. And Safari doesn't have a separate language setting either as well, but Chrome does. So we can go to the settings. And this is great for testing, obviously. You can show the advanced settings, and somewhere here is a language button. And it has the languages that are in there, and I can choose to add another language. So I can pick French and add it, and then I can drag it to the top to make it my primary. And then I can click Done. And then I can go back here and I can put in, let's come here and copy this. And you can see now that Chrome is set up to pretend it's, well, not to pretend, but set up so that it's sending out to websites, hey, I'm in French. We got back the French string, which is great. That's what we wanted. So my little demo actually worked. And of course, you can go back and change it. You can find it in all these lengthy list of Google settings. So I could put it back and reapply it, and I'm pretty sure if I refresh the page, it'll switch back to the English version. And Jay is pointing out an app that will help you do some localizations. As he wrote, unaffiliated plug, the tool called Arbed, A-R-B-E-D, and I believe there's a link to it on our third-party tools page in the doc wiki. It has a function to convert all static strings into constants, which can save you some time. And actually, I believe I've used that on a client project a couple of years ago, and it did save a lot of time. So yeah, if you do have a project you need, certainly checking that out might be worth your time. All right, so that's how web stuff works. I mean, not a lot of difference there. The other thing that you do have available to you on a web app are some built-in constants that allow you to localize some system messages. So if you go to the session class that's built in here and you expand the constants, you can see there's several constants on here. And the only reason these are here are so that you can provide your own localizations for these particular things. And these are some buttons that appear on system errors mostly. Error message here like this one. These are generic things, but you can get those translated to other languages as well. And you just do that using these built-in constants. All right, let's see. Amando is asking if the Lingua project source is available for customization. No, I don't believe it is. We only ship the actual executable app. I don't know if that's anything we would intend to ship the source for. I actually haven't seen the source for it. But if that's something you think you need, certainly file a feedback request. That can be considered by the engineering team. All right, so we saw a couple simple apps here that show you, fundamentally how localization works and how you would set it up in your app. Obviously, using it in a larger app is a bit more work. So I just want to quickly show you here the Eddie's example projects that have localizations. Both the desktop and the web are localized. So we'll just take a look at what that might look like from a system setup standpoint. So you can see there's a strings module here. And if I expand the constants, you can see there's a whole bunch of constants that have been localized for a variety of languages. And this was done using the same process that I just finished describing to all of you. Originally we wrote this, it was English only. Went through and moved all the hard-coded strings into dynamic constants, and then exported the Lingua files and then sent them out to people that could do the translations for us, and then imported them back in. And now we have this translated in a variety of languages. And then as you look around, the layout, you can see the use of the dynamic constants as opposed to hard coding the text in any of these things. Now, for things like column headers or whatnot, these are probably set in code. I don't recall off the top of my head. Labels are all set using this. But this can be a project to take a look at for a variety of purposes, but also if you do have a localization project that you need to jump into. Wolfgang is asking if Lingua itself is localized, and then he says, just kidding. I really have no idea if it is or not. And Jay is asking why the pre-supplied constants that are included in the web thing don't actually have translations for the major languages. That's a great question, Jay. I do not know. That is definitely worthy of a feedback request. Seems logical to me that we could get those translated and include them in there. I don't know if there's a technical reason why not, but it seems logical to me as well. All right, the last thing I have on my list here is to go back to Terry's question, which was, can you have, well, if I click on the right one, can you have the end user choose a language for the app outside of the OS language? Well, yes and no. You can absolutely set that up, but you're going to have to do it all yourself. You wouldn't be able to do that using the dynamic constants. The dynamic constant process is set up to map through to the OS language settings and pull in what's appropriate using those OS language files. What I've seen people do, and I've had projects and seen others apps that have had this request where essentially the app as it's running has a drop down of some sort that allows the user to pick a language right on the fly. And then the entire UI, essentially repaints itself in whatever language they've chosen. And the most common way that I've seen that sort of thing implemented is with a database of some kind that has all the translations in it, and all the values are looked up based on the selection. Nothing terribly clever there, but that's how that would work. And as Terry says, darn. Yep. Unfortunately, there's no great way to do that. And yeah, you can't. Switching the OS language generally can be a pain in the butt. Like I said, on OS 10, you actually have to go to the system preference, change the language. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't take effect till you log out and back in. On Windows, it takes effect immediately, but you have to restart the app. I don't recall Linux off the top of my head. And of course, that'll probably change based on the version of Linux. Tim is asking, what's the name of the sample project? I'm not sure what sample project. Are you referring to Eddie's electronics sample? That's the only one that I have that's included with Xojo at the moment. And those are accessible, right from the examples folder. This particular, I can throw up the sample project here that I've been the desktop and the web ones that I've been using for this webinar up on the webinar page, so you can download those and play around with them as well. But we don't have anything else included with Xojo at the moment beyond the Eddie's Electronics example that has localizations built in anyway. Yeah, and Terry says he used a database and some older VB apps as well. Yeah, that's pretty much the go-to way to do it when you have that requirement. All right, I'm just checking my list, but I think I've gone through everything I wanted to cover today, which is good. Went a little quicker than I expected. Some great questions. So I get to do my wrap-up spiel. If you have other questions, feel free to ask them as I'm doing this part. Let's see. The first thing I want to do is show everyone the upcoming webinar schedule. So this is today's Localizing the Apps. Last one of the year is third-party web services. Actually, I think there's one other thing I want to jump back to on the localizing part, just regarding date formats that we can briefly talk about. And then we just put up the schedule for next year. So webinars for January and February are now posted here. If you have other suggestions or whatnot, by all means, let me know. These webinars go through the end of February, and then I'll figure out with the conference in March, I'll have to figure out what the schedule will be for March and April. But these are the topics, and if you have specific questions or things you want to make sure I cover on any of these topics, again, by all means, let me know. Other than the topics, I haven't done much planning on any of these, so they're pretty open-ended, and I'll need to start putting together projects and an overall design I want to follow. All right, let's see. Now, before we continue, I see I got a few more questions up here, so... Yeah, and then to register for the webinars, just come to this page, click the register button, and you'll be registered. You'll get the URL, and they're all at the same time, Tuesdays, 1 p.m. Eastern, which is GMT -5, I believe. Terry's asking, how many total languages can you have at once in an app? Well, there's no actual limit. It'd be as many as you dare translate. And Jay has another tip here for Terry's question regarding languages. You could reassign strings in code using the region code. Yes, that's a good point. I don't know that would work any better than a database, but if we go back to that little technique we did at the beginning here, this little thing, it's possible you could make use of this instead of a database to pull out the localized values based on some setting. That might work. Obviously, it won't work for using stuff on the label control names or whatnot, but this might end up working as a database thing. Like I said, I just found out about this a month ago, so I haven't tried that technique to know if that has any limitations that would run into with the design you're talking about. But that might be something to consider as well. So thank you, Jay, for that reminder and suggestion. All right. Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is another thing you see, and I'll just touch on this briefly. When you're dealing with localized stuff, a big difference you see is date formatting. For example, here in the U.S., if I were writing today's date, I would write 12, what is today's date? 12/10/2013. Pretty much in the rest of the world, you would not write it like that. Uh, you might write 10/12/2013. You might write 2013, 12/10. So lots of little things to think about there. The same thing when displaying dates in long formats. So the thing to do there is to just make sure when you're displaying dates, you're using um, the two values here for long date and short date for displaying to the users. But when you're saving dates anywhere in a file or a database or something like that, save them in this format right here, which is the SQL date format. Not only is this clear and consistent, it also is sortable, which is pretty important for data retrieval. So it's important to think about that so that you don't accidentally design your app and end up saving your data in this format and then having some real trouble figuring out what it is, because these two things are totally valid dates. One could be, in the U.S., this could be October 12th. So, you don't want to stumble down that path and end up with a database that has a bunch of data that is in a mess. So always save your data using SQL date for the best consistency. Yes, and as someone's pointing out to me, it uses dashes. SQL date has dashes. I don't. Let's see what it looks like. Here we go. In case I get the format wrong. So there it is. For today, it would be 2013, December 10th. And it uses dashes, not slashes. But anyway, the important thing is to make sure you use the year first and month and then day. And of course, the other technique is you could also save the total seconds in a property depending on our database or XML file or wherever as a fallback. One thing I've seen, I think Objective-C often uses dates since 1970 or something like that. But the important thing is to save your dates in a non-ambiguous format that you can easily pull back and use and is sortable, that sort of thing. Wolfgang is asking about decimal points, and that is another great thing to think about. And that you want to use the format command. See if that comes up here in the language reference. Any data that you're, again, displaying to the user, you're going to want to use format so that it properly uses the strings. And Wolfgang particularly points out that in Germany, decimal points use a comma rather than the dot as the US uses. So with the format command, you can use the dot to specify that it should be a decimal, and then at display time, it will use whatever is configured in the user's operating system settings. And you can see the different things here. Decimal is probably the most common one, but I think also some areas use, in the US, we use a comma for separating thousands. Other areas use something else. Maybe they use a decimal. Maybe those two are flipped. I don't really know. But if you want that displayed appropriately, you'd make use of the format command, which brings up a similar point to when you're saving the data. You don't want to save the data formatted most likely, because then it might make it harder to pull the data back out depending on where your app is used. So you generally want to save the data uh, using a standard fixed mechanism. And most often that's using the dot for the decimal point. So format is generally used for displaying the information. Like if you have a double or something, you'd format it for a string to display. And if you need to actually convert it to a string value that you want to save somewhere, you can just use str, and then it will not apply the localization conversions, but it'll still allow you to format the number. And Amando's asking what he said. Maybe it's a silly question, but how does Xojo know what language the user is running? Well, the operating system provides that information, and Xojo just builds the app using the format specified by the OS. So when you see the structure here, and the OS takes care of loading up the particular language files and sending them along to the app so that those are what gets displayed. So essentially, Xojo is just building it when you use the dynamic constants anyway in the appropriate way so that the operating system can pretty much handle everything for you. And Terry is asking if string is limited to 7 digits. It may be. I don't really know off the top of my head. Let's see. 7 decimal places, I guess. That's hopefully more than 7 digits. All right. Check the time. All right. Yes, good. We wrapped up a few minutes early. Terry had one final comment to add to that. He had to end up writing his own string converter due to issues with what apparently are converting longer values. So something to keep in mind. I'm not aware specifically of what that might be, but something to keep an eye out for. And going back to here, so yeah, next week is accessing third-party web services, and we'll run through a few web services and how your Xojo apps can hook up to them, and then subsequent ones starting up in the new year. The archives of all the older webinars are up here on the Doc Wiki and also on the webinar page at the bottom. The Doc Wiki has the advantage of also having links to sample projects if the webinar did have a sample project. This one will also have some samples attached to it and should be up by the end of the week. And of course, I'll be doing this every webinar until the conference. Our Xojo Developer Conference is in March in Las Vegas in 2014. Be there or be square. 38 sessions. Oh, look, they've added all kinds of pictures. There's me. And lots of other people that have come to the conference in the past. Should be a great time at Las Vegas. Ton of great sessions. I'll be doing 5, I believe. And we're already talking about maybe doing a special webinar during the conference for people that can't attend. So we'll see. And if you have thoughts or suggestions on that, by all means, let us know. And of course, I like to remind everyone to head over to the very active and busy discussion forum when you have questions about Xojo. This is the place to go. And then a couple, I've got a question here from Wolfgang. Can you use special characters in Lingua? Whose names I don't know, but usually with those dots over the letters and whatnot. As far as I know, Wolfgang, yes, you can. I haven't tried that. I'm not 100% sure how this will go because I don't generally type those, but let's see here. So what do you hold down Option and press keys or something like that? Yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't work. It's a text input field the same as anything else. So, and you can assign those to constants. So I would expect that to work fine. And let's see here. I got a longer question from Solays. This is more of a general question. How about Solays? You shoot me an email with the gist of this. This is more of a general looking for information question. By all means, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer you. Now let's see. What is my email? Well, for all of you just dying to email me, there we are. Paul@xojo.com. I love to hear from webinar attendees, and certainly if you have questions, suggestions, or anything else, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. All right, I guess that wraps it up for today. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you, most of you, next week, hopefully. Bye now.